Kirk Schneider, PhD, is a licensed psychologist and leading spokesperson for contemporary existential humanistic psychology. Among his many posts, Dr. Schneider is the current president of the Existential-Humanistic Institute and adjunct faculty member at Saybrook University and Teachers College, Columbia University. A fellow of 5 divisions of the APA, Dr. Schneider has published over 200 articles, interviews, and chapters, and has authored or edited 13 books, including The Spirituality of Awe, The Polarized Mind, Awakening to Awe, and the forthcoming The Depolarizing of America, a guidebook for social healing. Dr. Kirk Schneider, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you very much, Izzy.
I wanted to focus on the current troubling times, the coronavirus pandemic, and consider ways in which an existential conception might help individuals to cope or help therapists when dealing with their clients. But first, perhaps it would be appropriate to get a broad brush concept of existential humanistic psychology.
You know, my thumbnail sketch of existential humanistic psychology is that it focuses on 2 basic questions, and they're both explicit questions and very often implicit questions that run through the therapy process. And those are, how are you presently living? So it's a question about, first of all, exploration and the freedom to explore what's going on for you at this time. Where are you at? How are you handling things? How are you managing? What are you feeling, sensing, thinking, intuiting at this time? And then the second question that really runs on the heels of that first question is the responsibility question. How are you willing to live? So 2 basic questions. How are you presently living? And a real check-in around that, and allowing yourself as much freedom to explore that as possible. And then the responsibility question, or ability to respond. So given where you're at, how are you willing to continue going? How are you willing to proceed into the world, given that this is where you're at? And this is often the battle that we see with clients and in our own lives, you know, between what's going on now, which for many of us, you know, could be quite challenging, could be quite a struggle, particularly in this time of the coronavirus. But then the question of how are you willing to live, which also opens up a question of freedom as well.
Yes.
And goes back to many of our forerunners, like Viktor Frankl, who I think in so many ways really set the bar for responding in times of despair, in times of great demand.
It does sound, the first half of your description, it sounds an incredibly, to use a very current term, mindful, but to have that complete awareness, though not purely of breath or of body and sensation, but also of the feelings and the thoughts and the contents of those feelings and thoughts. So it sounds as if to get to that place, you have to develop an ability to be present in yourself, which might be a first hurdle for people.
Yes. Presence is a key concept in existential psychology, existential humanism. I mean, that really is the foundation. I like to think of it as the hub of the wheel.
Okay.
Where you know, other areas then sort of blossom forth or emerge. I would define presence, and there are many ways to define presence. I mean, certainly overall, it's a kind of heightened awareness. but it involves so many aspects. I like to therapeutically home in on a couple of aspects: the holding and illuminating of that which is palpably significant within oneself and between oneself and the other. So presence uh, performs a kind of a holding function. It holds, it provides a sense of safety or sacred space or containment. If one can tap into that, a pause, if you will. Rollo May talked beautifully about the significance of the pause in Freedom and Destiny. And that's a lot of where presence begins. If one can clear the space to simply be with, again, what is bubbling up, what's brewing, what's going on for one. And then out of that, one is able to illuminate more deeply what is going on, kind of elaborating on the immediate, sensing, feeling, tuning into thoughts. Then how does one deepen that? If one stays with it, one can usually deepen one's presence. And that is so key, because that's really the method and the aim of existential humanistic therapy. It's the medium through which the presence of the therapist and the client are working, and also really the overall aim of the work, which is to be able to connect with one's whole bodily being to the degree possible. Because so much of the time, struggle has to do with the cutting off or the blocking off of parts of ourselves that we can't deal with, that we see as foreign and other. So through the presencing process of the therapy, we're gradually and hopefully at the client's own pace able to align with, connect with, or immerse in as much of one's whole bodily experience of whatever it is they're struggling with or living as possible, as a
As you were
holistic picture.
as you were talking there, I feel very aware of this, the sense I've had for the last 2 weeks of adrenaline coursing through me, and the tightness of chest, which I started getting very neurotic about at the beginning. But it's an anxiety response, and
Yeah.
and I'm aware of it being there all the time, and of trying to cut it off, of trying to distract myself from it. So perhaps looking at this situation exactly as we're in, where I'm sure I'm very far from alone in these experiences. Would it be possible for you to sort of offer some guidance on how an individual feeling in this kind of place might respond and deal with that?
I'll do my best.
Thank
As
you.
as we were saying before, we're all kind of groping with the situation of the unknown, and if ever there was an existential crisis, I mean, this is certainly one of them. Well, I practice a form of existential humanistic therapy that I call existential integrative therapy, which means that I really attempt to attune my presence to where that person's at. I was implying that before, but presence can also be drawn on as a kind of barometer for how do we create the most conducive conditions for healing here? How do I reach you, for example? And so I think this is a relevant question for ourselves, in dealing with ourselves as well. So what I'm saying is I'm integrative in the sense that I'm not going to push somebody who's not ready or interested in going very deeply into the presence that many of us feel is optimally healing for many people, but not for everybody. See, this is where I think we're beginning to shift in terms of um, a little different take on presence and existential therapy than some of our forebears who really were quite insistent on depth exploration and depth awareness. But I say, no, if we're really going to be existential, we have to tune in with where the person is living right now. And sometimes the person is just trying to get through the night,
Yes.
or they're in a very fragile place. Uh, so sometimes too much presence or deepening of awareness could be overwhelming.
Mm.
And so I almost sensed in what you were saying that you kind of intuited that at times you feel maybe a need to block it off. Um, I think it was Heidegger who said, we all need to sleep once in a while. He was talking about during the day, not just at night also. But I think that's true. I think we need to go about these kinds of methodologies with a degree of discernment and
Yes, because
again attunement to the moment.
in this kind of heightened state of anxiety that so many people
Yeah,
must be feeling
right.
in, and particularly in the early stages with all the uncertainty, that kind of presence could feel a very raw state to be in, and it would be difficult to be able to sustain it. I imagine
Yes.
for very long. It would be, to use your terms, a case of holding in, touching, making contact, illuminating, and then gently backing off, perhaps.
Yes, I think it's helpful to be as aware as one can, and so yes, checking in could be very valuable, but then being able to, as consciously as possible, make the choice, let's say, to, you know, have some comfort food or watch a movie or something maybe a little lighter that helps you to work with something again at your own pace. This is very important. It's not about the theory or the therapist imposing the pace. It's much more about an invitational sort of uh, uh, process. Now, there are times when, of course, we believe more in pressing the person and challenging them. But that's got to be done, I think, very delicately with a great deal of sensitivity, because you could be pushing the person directly into the very thing they've designed their life around avoiding.
Yes.
Not even talking about a particular moment, but uh, in psychotherapy, it's often so much about a terror of going into these very difficult places, and it's been a lifetime terror. So you're almost literally pushing somebody into a place that they fear will annihilate them. And we don't want to do that to ourselves either. We want to go about this process with compassion.
Yes.
Um, and self-compassion is extremely important here. So I would say it's much more about cultivating presence to the degree appropriate or relevant for the moment, for the context uh, within which you are confronted, you know. And so, yeah, it makes sense. I do that too at times. I just this morning turned off the news because, I'm pretty absorbent in that way. I mean, I do like to keep up with the news and try to get oriented with what's going on in the world as much as possible. And it's a lot of my work is around that too, being aware of that. But I realized, no, something's coming up here. I feel like I'm at my limit right now. I don't want to hear any more.
Mm.
No more numbers, no more of this kind of bombardment of, rather fearful information.
It does sound as if that a certain amount of presence as well can attune you to an appreciation of exactly as you said, what might be right at that time, whether it's hearing the news or
Exactly.
whether it's going to watch that television show.
Yes.
And I imagine it's going to be for so many people yet more important because they're cooped up in close quarters with loved ones, but loved ones that they don't usually spend 24/7 with, and that puts another additional layer of some comfort and solace, obviously, but stress too.
Absolutely. I have a very personal situation like that with, my wife and I have been pretty much confined to quarters here for several weeks now and counting. We had good background in this because we lived in a little coach house in Boston for our first 2 years together. And it was like a one-room place virtually with a literal hole in the wall. We used to stuff with paper. It was cold weather there too. So we had some tests, but no, I think the better part of wisdom and prudence in this situation is to really respect your own spaces, certainly to come together and connect to the degree you can. And this is true for people, I think, over social media too, if there's no one right there. But also to respect one's need for some time alone, some maybe just very quiet, uh, you know, regrouping time, whether that's reading or, maybe watching something or music.
Yes.
Yeah, those can all be. I mean, the issue here is more around how do we best cope? How do we nurture ourselves to the degree possible through a very difficult situation?
I understand that the fear of death is really at the core of existential thinking about psychological suffering. And yet you've
Yeah.
stated before that the flip side of terror is freedom and wonder. And I know not now, but perhaps on a longer term perspective, and that to offer us hope, and maybe even in flashes, in moments, we can perhaps transition into a richer experience of life, and
Mhm.
that might offer people some sense of encouragement or solace as we go through these troubles and anxieties.
Yeah, I think one of the important things to realize about trauma, about the shaking of the foundations, if you will, of one's world, uh, is that it is shaking us out of the routine and familiar. It's shaking us, or it's a tear in the fabric of the known and well trodden, if you will, and and that, of course, can be horrifying
Mm.
and give one a sense of groundlessness. I think this is a key element in our existential way of thinking about life, actually, that we all are situated in groundlessness. I mean, very literally, we are. We're, a speck of dust whirling around the sun and 67,000 miles per hour and hurtling through the universe, I think, at 1.2 million miles per hour to a destination completely unknown. And we come out of an origin that's really completely unknown, at least to most people that I know. Um, and so, I mean, we're literally in this suspense. The thing is, the I think one of the most important uh, aims in life is to be able to find ground within this groundlessness.
Yes.
And so, getting back to your point or your uh, theme there about freedom can be the flip side of anxiety. That's something that Rollo May used to talk about. I put it in terms of uh, groundlessness can be overwhelming and terrifying because it is so aimless. It's directionless. It's like you're cut from the tether of the mothership, if you will. So you're just floating out in unknown space, the radically unknown, and floundering and feeling like one's drowning often. So yes, this is where obviously healers and healing can be so important, and helping people find these supportive spaces to find their footing. And there's a whole range of ways of finding one's footing, of course. But that can slowly turn that from overwhelming and anxiety producing to, something maybe even that's a little bit intriguing. This is different. This is radically different from how I was living before. It's a huge loss because I've lost, maybe the person or the certain activities that I did before, but what is beginning to emerge here? And I think this is what really good therapy does. I feel like it did that in my own life after a very major trauma with the death of my brother when I was a very small child. I had a great advantage of very attuned parents who sent me to a psychoanalyst at a very young age. But I think a lot of what was happening there is that he was helping me to find some kind of ground within the groundlessness and to begin to realize possibilities in this new way of living. You can't realize possibilities if you're in total panic.
No.
It took me a long time to begin to realize possibilities, but I started to actually connect with things that were a little different or unfamiliar at a quite early age. A lot of that took the form of science fiction stories, actually. Stories like The Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, and these windows into radically different ways of thinking, ways of being, use of imagination. And I think it started me on a road to creativity, which has been extremely important in my life. But I have no presumptions about the power of trauma. I mean, the overwhelm, the humbling quality of that. I've had a couple of major times where that's been a huge challenge for me. A second time happened when I was in graduate school, and I think a lot of the early stuff had come back. I won't belabor the reasons for that, but it was a very difficult time. And again, I found through the grace of a wonderful fellow student, probably the most important healer therapist of my life at that time, who again helped me. The main way that she helped me was through cultivating presence between us and within myself, which gave me some grounding to then be able to experience a much fuller range of my feelings and thoughts and body sensations, etc. And that's the greatest gift one can get, I think, or one of the greatest gifts.
It almost seems as if you're able to actually experience the emotions that might be frightening or troubling, but if you're able to experience them and articulate them, that enables them to in some way not be strangling you anymore, that they can have that kind of expression, and then they can transform or they can free you. Does that align with what you're saying?
Very much so. And it aligns with that whole notion of being able to befriend one's own being to the degree possible. Um, I mean, how many times do we meet people who, intimidate us or scare us, let's say, and yet as we get to know them, as we can, if we have a chance to sit and talk with them or connect with them, and I'm not saying it's true with everyone, of course, but with many people, and this is very true, I think, with people on different political camps or different religious views, or cultural views, the more that we can sit and just be present with each other and really hear each other and allow each other to emerge, we get to see the fuller picture and realize that what we stamped on them, the label we gave to them or to that foreignness, does not fit with the fuller being that we're with. And I think that's very true internally as well. You're in a dark basement where things are crashing and falling and you're banging into all kinds of things. But as you stay in that dark, your eyes begin to adjust very slowly to things that looked monstrous, maybe, something, piece of metal sticking out. You suddenly realize, oh, that's a part of, this table or a shelf or something. My point is that which appears monstrous and other at first can often turn out to be something quite different and something that even potentially could enrich our lives.
And I in no way want to suggest that the pandemic experience that we're going through is not entirely monstrous, but there have been, on English radio, there's a show on BBC Radio 4 called The Moral Maze, which is a panel show with philosophers talking about the ethical issues of the day. And last week they were discussing what changes to society could potentially come from going through this collective trauma. Because I do want to go on to your book in a moment, and I think that your forthcoming book, because I do think that there potentially are some real connections there, that the way that as a globe, but as individual nations, as well as individual people and individual communities, we go through something and get to the other side. There may be some way in which transitions at larger scales take place too.
No, I think that's a great point. And I know people are talking about how this trauma we're going through now seems to be humbling people more, seems to be making people realize more about how we're in the same boat with each other. So maybe it's reducing the bickering to some degree. Certainly the political polarization is being tamped down to some degree, I think, although it's still brewing there. But yes, I think all these things are very significant in terms of where we may be headed. I think the whole thing hinges on if we could, well, first of all, if we can make it through physically, of course, that's the bottom line. But as we hopefully make it through this, if we take the lessons seriously about the importance of seeing each other's humanity more, recognizing that we're all flesh and blood creatures and that we're vulnerable, then I think we have a chance of addressing some of the just out of control down spiral of hatred and divisiveness that has been gathering momentum worldwide, I would say. But we need to really take it seriously, and I think we need some skills to capture these lessons, if you will. We'll be needing that more and more. We can't just go back to business as usual, in my view. I think we need, I mean, I've called for this for a long time, but I actually think we need an army of depth healers as much as we have an army of combatants for this world.
The book, The Depolarization of America, what you were talking about, the polarized mind. I know you've written another book on that subject,
Yeah,
but
yes.
what if you could just give us a brief sense of what the polarized mind is and how it's manifested socially?
I define the polarized mind as the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And I see this, I used to call it as the main psychological plague of humanity. I think it is one of the chief scourges or plagues of our evolution, virtually from time immemorial. But certainly we can trace the polarized mind to very early Babylonian tales, and I do this in my book, beginning with the Enuma Elish. It's one of the very early myths of Babylonia, with the goddess Tiamat and her husband, and they're used to having a very strict order in their world and everything in place. She's the creatrix, and then they have kids. And you know how kids can upset the order of the parental generation, and one in particular is very rebellious, and it gets so heated that the kids actually decide to put a contract out on the dad, and all hell breaks loose. I mean, so you start getting these extremes. The parents get more polarized, and they go after the kids, and they're extremely abusive and killing the kids, and then the kids try to kill the parents, and then finally, as I understand it, after several generations, I believe it's one of the kids who is able to come up with a god called Marduk, who just comes in and levels them all and creates a whole new world. So Marduk is like the grandest tyrant you could imagine. But these are the kinds of cycles, vicious cycles of polarization that seem to happen generation after generation. And you know, the Greeks called it hubris, and then hubris leads to nemesis, which is the backlash against hubris. And so you have the Persians decimating the Greeks, and the Greeks decimating the Persians, and the ante keeps getting cranked up more and more, and pretty soon you've got cultures that become quite tyrannical.
I
And
see.
you have this glowing moment of Athens, right? Democracy of Athens, but that didn't last all that long, and you eventually have imperial Rome, and you have imperialism throughout the Western and Eastern world. So my point is that we never seem to really learn that we've got to take this issue of polarization very seriously. We certainly see it in our times. And it's driven by fear. That's my other point here.
That was when I was reading about your book, I was thinking there is an additional fear that in a time of fear, it can go one of two ways, can't it? Either there is this sense of we've been going wrong. We need to look at the world in a different way. We need to be able to act together for the betterment of our societies, or the fear leads to a further increase in polarization and a further claim that, well, they are other.
Exactly. If there is no mediation or no intervention at the time, around the time of the trauma, then so often it leads to extremism, to polarization, to doing everything one can to avoid the opposite, doing everything one can to avoid the terror of the traumatized self, if you will. So what you see in both cultures and individuals is the quick closing of ranks. If there's no mediation at that time, if there aren't cooler heads, then you're going to see immediate military response, reactions, I would call them, more than responses, because I see responses as tending to be more deliberative. Mm-hmm. But these are more knee-jerk reactions. You blasted our tower, we're going to come in with a much greater force and decimate your whole world. Mm-hmm. Of course, then what crops up? Okay, then we're going to find other ways of, sabotaging you. But, where are our healers? Where are our deliberators at that point? Or people who can work with the trauma, a bit more. They've also been called helpful witnesses. Alice Miller has written about this on the individual level. One of the differences between people who have gone the route of Stalin and Hitler, for example, based on horrifying childhoods, and the lives of, she brought up people like Picasso and Nietzsche, was that the Picassos and the Nietzsches had helpful witnesses along the way who were able to be present to them, speak to them, and help them work with their traumas. All these folks had severe abuse and trauma in their childhoods, but these Picassos, the Nietzsches, etc., had people who were able to work with them, help them find some grounding, and help them to then transform the trauma into something more creative, more supportive, hopefully, of the betterment of humanity, as opposed to, no intervention and just backlash, vengeance on the part of these other leaders.
That does make me think at the moment with the way that families will be going through difficult circumstances in their financially, in terms of family members perhaps contracting COVID-19, just the uncertainty, the pressure, the stress, that it is going to be very important, not just for there to be helpful witnesses externally, but also that those who have greater maturity or responsibility are able to perform that role for their younger family members.
Yes, the more that we can have family members who can keep a degree of centeredness in this storm, and who can draw on, past healing themselves, I think the better off we are. And of course, not everybody is fortunate to have that, but we do seem to have an increasingly resourceful mental health community. At least that's what I'm hearing, that people do seem to be mobilizing around intervening as much as possible, supporting as much as possible, even through electronic media. This is a way of reaching many more people in a way.
And reaching people at this time as well, when you can't reach them physically.
Exactly. Yeah, but as I was suggesting before, I think this is going to involve a societal shift. I mean, at this point, it's happening piecemeal, and there are some very hopeful elements to it. There are hopeful elements to the increasing parity of our priority on mental health as well as physical health. But as far as I'm concerned, many of my colleagues were not nearly there yet, because we have a lot of mental health crises that are not being dealt with. I actually, I'll just maybe put a quick plug in for it. I've proposed before APA Council an agenda to create a task force to look into the merit of calling on Congress to create a psychologist general of the United States who would be on a par with the Surgeon General, but would be focused strictly on, or more or less strictly on psychological struggles and psychological means of mediating those struggles, and would work closely with a Surgeon General, with other government agencies that tend to be more medicalized. But you would have an overseer who spent 24/7 or just very full time devoted to so many of the psychological environmental aspects of what moves people to become polarized, to become dysfunctional, and to suffer emotionally.
And it seems to me that after these circumstances, because these circumstances will take their toll, that a figure like that, as well as with the specific case of polarized minds, that also in the more general and possibly more widespread case of people having suffered as a result of what we're going through now, that having an advocate, a spokesperson, could be very powerful and very important in the future.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Wouldn't it be consoling to not only hear from medical officials, but also our official psychologically oriented leader who could be a psychologist. This doesn't have to be a psychologist. It basically would be a distinguished expert in psychological means of dealing with trauma and struggle. To have that person also speak to people about ways of coping and ways of finding sustenance in this very difficult time.
You mentioned sustenance, and I am mindful of your time now, but I didn't want to end without mentioning awe and wonder. It's an area that's very close to my heart. I feel it's been very important for me, and when I've struggled with low mood, that an awareness of awe and wonder in the world I've found great comfort and great solace, and I think it has acted as a kind of transition. It's like a switch coming on, and you can be more primed to notice. Right now, people might be stuck in their homes, but they're not necessarily limited from putting themselves in the way of experiences that might be able to generate those kind of emotions that could give them sustenance now.
Yes, I am often thinking of a great novel by a fellow existentialist, Albert Camus, who wrote The Plague.
Yes, yes, and you mentioned how polarized minds was kind of like a plague, and I was thinking there is an interesting metaphor here.
Very interesting and strong metaphor, and he brings it out in that book. But thinking of one of the final scenes where Dr. Rue, who has been one of the main healers attempting to help the populace of this town, Oran, to deal with the actual physical plague. Well, him and his assistant are, bathing in the Mediterranean toward the end, and kind of looking at the overview of the city lights in the background, and just taking in the degree of pain and torment that they had just been through, that they had witnessed, that they're still witnessing to some degree. But then for a brief moment, catching a glimpse of the beauty of the Mediterranean, and of the moonlight, of just really a moment of aliveness, even if it is a moment and they're going to have to go back to their labors or what have you. Well, I think Camus is great on, like Viktor Frankl was, great on reminding us of our capacity to take an attitude toward a given set of facts. The given set of facts may be extremely trying and possibly even torturous, as in the case of Viktor Frankl in the death camps. And yet, somehow, he was able to glimpse the face of his wife and a ray of sunshine, a moment of beauty of the Bavarian mountain in the background. And I don't want to overly romanticize this, but I guess my point is that if people can take some time to really savor, let's say maybe their relationship with someone, piece of music that they're listening to, the sky, even some moments outside, cherish the breeze, the fresh air, and we are getting fresher air now because so much is closed down. I think this could be an important discovery or aspect of even very, very difficult times. My old mentor, James Bugenthal, used to talk about play the hand you're dealt. And he also quoted, I think it was Alan Watts, something to the effect of the mark of a vital human being or a vital moment is the capacity to reinterpret that which cannot be denied. So can we find these moments, these glimpses of nourishment in our lives, and can we savor them? It's like the best one can do when so much is out of our control, really. Except our capacity to take an attitude to situations, which is not infinite. I think Jean-Paul Sartre was maybe extreme on his belief that we have this infinite access to any attitude at any moment. I think that may be a bit of fool's gold, but we certainly have often a much greater range of possible ways of responding to or experiencing something than we generally tap into.
Thank you. That seems to me a good place to wrap up, unless there is anything else you wanted to add, Dr. Schneider.
Only that I wish for all of us to make it through this, in as optimal and healing a way as possible. And hope we can draw from it as we emerge from this crisis. Uh, the awe-based lessons of living, if you will, to be able to really savor life, savor the gift that we have, and to be able to take time with it and stand in wonder before it and feel our participation in something much greater, and let that feed whatever it is we're doing or however we're being.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kirk Schneider, for being on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, Izzy.